The first thing that you should know about data protection is that my name is Stefano, not Stefano. I am the Group Data Protection Officer and I'm here to help you to get data protection right. The General Data Protection Regulation, better known as GDPR, is a new EU regulation that introduces stricter requirements on the collection and processing of personal data, with fines for non-compliance that can go up to 20 million euros. The GDPR is primarily designed to protect individuals from a non-transparent and indiscriminate data collection and processes, such as the one carried out by certain social media platforms. However, its principles and requirements apply to Sportradar as well. Please note, processing personal data is not an issue as long as this is done in line with the GDPR. This video is intended to give you an overview of the key requirements so you can ensure that you comply in your areas of the business. For any additional information or detailed queries, you should contact the privacy team at privacy@sportradar.com.
Knowing and complying with the requirements of the GDPR is important for all Sportradar Group employees inside and outside of the EU. The GDPR applies to all companies located inside of the EU that process personal data. The GDPR applies to all companies outside of the EU which offer services in the EU or monitor and process the personal data of individuals physically located in the EU.
As a result, Sportradar has adopted the GDPR standards and requirements for all our global processing activities. Basically, the GDPR affects everyone's business, and now I'm gonna explain the main changes in 5 easy steps. Step 1. Learning the key definitions.
Personal data is any information which can directly or indirectly make an individual identifiable. Not only traditional identifiers qualify as personal data, for example name or surname, but also online identifiers such as IP addresses or cookies. Please note, the results of sporting performance of an individual athlete, number of goals scored, appearances, etc., qualify as personal data. Sensitive personal data. This is any information concerning an individual that reveals his or her racial or ethnic origin, political opinion, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic or biometric data, data concerning an individual's sex life or sexual orientation, data concerning health. Note: it is forbidden to process sensitive personal data unless certain conditions apply. Please contact the privacy team prior to collecting or processing any sensitive data. Processing of personal data is any operation performed on personal data. Processing may take the form of recording, combining, erasing, or destroying personal data. A data subject is any individual that has his or her personal data. The controller decides on the purposes and means for the collection and processing of the personal data. The controller may hire processors which will process the personal data for the controller by following the controller's instructions.
Please note, often Sportradar will act as a processor and as a controller.
The GDPR introduces new security requirements. Here are the definitions. Anonymization is the process of making it impossible to trace the data back to a particular individual. Examples of anonymization are data used for statistical purposes, for example, 20% of the users are from Germany, or anonymized IP addresses through the use of hashing and salting techniques. Pseudonymization. This is the processing of personal data in such a manner that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific individual without the use of additional information. For example, storing or transferring personal data using a pseudonym, such as player number 123, instead of the actual data subject's plain name, such as Cristiano Ronaldo, for example. In this instance, data would be broken down and stored separately in different files, servers, or locations. Encryption. This is the process of obscuring information to make it unreadable without special knowledge of a secret key. Please note, consult the information security team to get recommendations on how to secure personal data from a technical perspective, including anonymization, pseudonymization, and encryption.
Step 2. Understanding the principles for processing personal data.
There must be a legal justification to process personal data. Under the GDPR, there are 5 legal grounds for processing that may apply to Sportradar personal data processing activities. These are consent from the data subject, legitimate interests of the controller, performance of a contract with the data subject, compliance with a legal obligation, and finally, public interest. Personal data should be stored for no longer than is necessary for the purposes for which the personal data is collected or processed. The personal data should not be processed for other and incompatible purposes than the original one for collection. The personal data being collected and processed shall be limited to what is strictly necessary for achieving your predetermined purposes. The personal data being processed must be as accurate as possible. The processing must be done in a transparent manner to the data subject. Amongst other things, the data subject must be informed of how his or her personal data is being processed.
Step 3. Data transfer and relationship with external parties.
The GDPR requires personal data controllers and processors to have a data protection agreement in place when receiving or transferring personal data from or to a third party. A data protection agreement is a contract which contains specific provisions required by the GDPR. Please note, if your unit or team involves any third party in personal data collection and processing, the appropriate data protection agreement shall be put in place. Examples of third parties that may be involved in personal data collection or processing are payroll processors, cloud storage services, and things of the like. The privacy and legal teams developed templates of these agreements, which have to be used by all units that receive or transfer personal data from or to third parties. If you are transferring personal data and this is being transferred to a third party located outside of the EU, a data protection agreement containing specific provisions may need to be in place. Note, this does not apply to transfers to Sportradar Group companies located outside of the EU. Intra-group transfers is being addressed as a separate issue by the legal and privacy team.
Step 4. Accountability.
Under the GDPR, Sportradar must not only be compliant with the new data protection standards, but it must also be able to showcase compliance to the Data Protection Authority during audits. For that purpose, there are 2 ways to showcase compliance. Every unit must keep a record of their personal data processing activities. To comply with this requirement, every unit must accurately fill out the Sportradar data inventory to ensure that all the data being processed is reported. If you do not have access to the data inventory, please send a request to the Sportradar privacy team, privacy@sportradar.com. When carrying out project or data processing activities, a privacy impact assessment can be performed in order to assess the risk level. The Data Protection Officer has developed a template questionnaire which is available for all units.
Step 5. Data subject rights and data breach.
The GDPR not only introduces new obligations to controllers and processors, but it also affords data subjects new rights. The GDPR now requires controllers and processors to respond to a data subject's request within 30 days of receiving that request. As such, Sportradar employees must be prepared to respond to such requests via the DPO if necessary.
Okay, so these are the main data subject rights. Right to erasure.
Upon request and when meeting certain conditions, data subjects have the right to have their data erased.
Right to access.
Data subjects have the right to access their personal data and to learn more about how their data is being processed upon request.
Right to rectification.
Upon request, data subjects have the right to have their data rectified by the controller in case of inaccuracy.
Right to object.
Upon request and when meeting certain conditions, data subjects have the right to have their data erased. Under the GDPR, personal data breaches must be reported to the Data Protection Authority within 72 hours from the discovery of the breach. Sportradar employees must notify the Data Protection Officer at privacy@sportradar.com of an occurrence or of a suspicion of an occurrence as soon as a personal data breach or suspected data breach is identified. A personal data breach is a breach of security leading to the unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data. All Sportradar employees must be familiarized with the Sportradar personal data breach policy. Examples of a data breach are emails containing personal data of employees sent to a third party by mistake, employee password leaks.
Okay, so guys, at this point you probably already understood that GDPR compliance is everyone's business. Unit managers are responsible to ensure compliance in their unit, but also employees have individual responsibility to ensure that their processing activities are carried out in line with the GDPR. So identify and record all the personal data being processed by your unit and update our existing data inventory. Establish a maximum retention period for each data being processed at your unit and justify it according to the original purpose of collection. Include that retention period in our existing data inventory and make sure that data is permanently deleted or anonymized at the end of such the retention period. So first of all, establish to what third parties you are transferring personal data, what personal data is being transferred, where those third parties are established and where do they process personal data. Then go on my Confluence page, Privacy and Data Protection, and you need to customize the relevant data protection agreement and conclude it with the relevant third parties. So first of all, you need to define the purposes for collecting and processing personal data. You then need to state those purposes in our existing data inventory and do not process the personal data for any other incompatible purposes with the ones originally established. This is particularly relevant in the context of further data analysis performed by our analytics teams. Before uploading the data, make sure that the original purpose of collection is communicated to prevent having the data being used for different and incompatible purposes by other teams. Upload only anonymized data in the buckets where possible. For example, 20% of the users are from Germany. When this is not technically feasible, pseudonymize the personal data you upload, for example, user123 instead of his plain name, where this is feasible. Personal data being uploaded on the data lake shall be limited to what is strictly necessary for the analytics team to perform the tasks that you are requesting them to perform. At the end of the retention period, make sure to delete or anonymize the personal data that you uploaded to the data lake. So first of all, reach out immediately to the Data Protection Officer at privacy@sportradar.com. Then record the data breach according to the data breach policy that you can find on my Confluence page. False. The GDPR applies also to data processing activities that are not taking place in the EU. If this is not clear, please go back to the first part of the video and watch it again. False. The GDPR allows personal data to be processed as long as the processing activities are in line with the principles and the requirements of the GDPR. False. Under the GDPR, any information which can lead directly or indirectly to the identification of an individual can be considered personal data, including IP addresses. False. Under GDPR, processing is any handling of personal data, including storing, If this is not clear, please go back and watch again step 1. False. GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. A regulation is a type of EU law which does not require any domestic implementation. From the 25th of May 2018, all data processing companies are expected to be compliant. False. Data protection compliance is everyone's business. You are responsible for ensuring compliance with the GDPR. Not Stefano.
That's good. Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.